All right, welcome to your week 14 lecture. This week we're going to be talking about Texas fiscal policy, which deals with the taxing and spending and budget of the state of Texas. Since this is week 14, you have this week's lecture, and the next week's lecture, week 15, and then you are done with hearing me on these videos. So congratulations, you're almost there. The light's at the end of the tunnel. However, I want you guys to keep in mind that your essay is due May 1st, so you have about 2 weeks left to do that. So if you haven't already started, now would probably be a good time. If you have already started, then good job for you. And if you have any questions, send those my way. Keep in mind that there is the writing guide under the Lessons tab. You can consult that writing guide folder. There's a number of helpful links and tips and things like that that will help you as you write your essay. And it'll kind of give you an idea of what I'm looking for when you write your essay as well. So consult that writing guide folder. It'll help you out tremendously as you approach your essay. But let's go ahead and talk about this week's topic. Like I said, it's fiscal policy, and let's go ahead and begin here. What is fiscal policy? Well, fiscal policy in general is the policies each government adopts in relation to its powers to tax its citizens and spend such revenue to benefit the public at large or specific citizens. So it's all about the government's powers to tax and spend. And we all know about the federal government. They tax and they spend, and that's within the constitutional powers and things like that. But the state of Texas, each individual state also needs to raise taxes and be sure to spend its money as well. So, the government can also use fiscal policy to regulate the economy through its powers to tax and spend as well. It can choose to boost the economy. It can choose to help out the economy in the ways that it spends its own money. Governments derive their budgets from the taxes collected, and so that's why it's very important to keep that in mind when we talk about fiscal policy. And all of this has to do with macroeconomics. Fiscal policy deals with the macroeconomic environment, or the economic system at large, and how the economy is doing within the state of Texas. If you remember back to week 1, we talked about the definition of politics, which is who gets what, when, and how, and that came from Harold Laswell. Well, because the game of politics is all about deciding who gets what, part of that also involves deciding who gets to pay for what, and that's part of fiscal policy in general. Going back to Harold Laswell, who gets what, when, and how, well, someone has to pay for it, for the things that they get, and who's going to do that. Fiscal policy is really all about taxation and expenditures, more or less. And so through the taxing and spending, we derive a budget. And like I said, governments derive their budgets through their power to tax. Most states have income tax, Texas does not. But Texas does have a number of other ways to raise taxes or to raise funds for their budget, such as property tax, sales tax, and things like that. General functions of a budget was just trying to plan out the expenditures that the state is going to spend that year. Because they've raised a certain amount of tax money for their revenue, they need to then plan a budget and plan out how they're going to spend that money. So that's generally the planning of expenditures. A budget also deals with authorization of programs, employee salaries, and benefits to the public at large. That's all contained within the budget. What programs are going to get money, how much are we going to pay our employees, our bureaucrats, and our regular teachers and public service employees and things like that, employee salaries, and then also benefits, health benefits, health care costs, and things like that. And then finally, a budget establishes the standards of accountability for programs and agencies. The budget makes sure that programs are accountable for the money that they spend and that we can audit those particular programs for their spending as well. Here in Texas, our budget process includes basically different institutions. The budget process has a number of inputs and outputs and things like that, but there are certain institutions involved. First one that we've talked about for a number of times here, we talked about it within the legislature lecture, and we also talked about it within the plural executive and things like that. Institutions involved in the budget process here in Texas include the Legislative Budget Board, the Legislative Audit Committee, you also have the Governor's Budget Office, the GBO, you also have the Comptroller of Public Accounts, and then you have the individual spending agencies, the agencies that actually spend money from the budget. Those are all the institutions that are involved in the budget process in Texas. And you have all these institutions contributing their 2 cents on what the budget should look like, where the budget money should go, and things like that. So all these institutions have a huge say in what goes on within the budget in Texas. Steps in the budget cycle include these 4 basic steps. These are basically the 4 basic steps of almost any budget, if you will. First off, the planning. Like I already mentioned, they have to plan their budget out, and there's a lot of actors involved in the planning. Certain bureaucratic agencies may want more money, and so they try to lobby for more money, and that goes into the planning. Certain sectors of the government may not be doing so well, and so that's part of the planning as well. Should we cut those? Should we cut those government agencies? Should we cut those benefits and things like that? And that all goes into the planning. So there's many actors involved in the planning cycle. Authorization of the bill. That usually goes to the Appropriations Committee within the legislature to actually authorize the bill and sign off on it. Budget execution, putting the budget into plan, usually includes the spending agencies. The agencies that will actually spend the budget money and execute the budget thoroughly are the different bureaucratic agencies involved. And then auditing. Auditing is actually a very important part of the budget here in Texas. Auditing is done by the Legislative Auditing Committee, the Legislative Audit Committee, the LAC, if you will. They're the ones that audit the budget each year, make sure that the money was spent properly, and that it was spent, certain amounts of the money were spent in order to keep it going. And the auditing is a very unique part here in Texas because Texas requires a balanced budget, and so they need to audit the budget to make sure that it is balanced. And that's why we have the Legislative Audit Committee to keep track of those sorts of things. Planning considerations that go into the budget, going back to the planning part, we're going to deal with each 4 parts of that budget execution, the steps in the budget cycle. We're going to deal with each 4 of these right now. All right, sorry, that's kind of a mess there. But the planning considerations. When we talk about planning, we need to talk about it very uniquely here in Texas, because if you remember back to the legislature lecture, remember that Texas only meets once every 2 years. The Texas legislature meets once every 2 years on odd number years. So they actually need to consider a budget for 2 years. When they meet every 2 years, they have to consider the budget not only for that odd number year that they meet in, but also for that even number year that they meet in. So you have to basically have a 2-year budget, because that's how infrequently the legislature meets. It's really the only major urban state with a biennial budget, meaning a 2-year budget. Because Texas has a citizen legislature, and because they only meet once every 2 years, this state actually has to plan for 2 years. And it's very odd because most major urban states do have a professional legislature. So that's why it's the only major urban state with a biennial budget. And then the balanced budget. Like I said, Texas is unique because they have a requirement for a balanced budget. Now, most states do have a requirement for balanced budget, but it's unique to Texas because they require a balanced budget, and because it has to be for 2 years. They need to be forward-thinking and looking forward to the 2 years ahead. Dedication of fund sources. They also consider that when planning the budget. There's federal funds restrictions that they must follow. And then there's also constitutional and statutory restrictions on state funds that are within the Constitution or within statutes passed by Texas. There's restrictions on state funds and how they can spend them, and so they need to adjust the budget to consider those as well. Constitutional limits on taxation that are included in the Texas Constitution. There's several of them here. I won't list them all, or I won't give you the exact articles, but they do have a pay-as-you-go limitation, meaning you must have the funds available to pay for it before you actually go ahead and execute it or execute a certain policy. You need to have the funds actually available for it. So that's a pay-as-you-go. You can never accrue debt in the state of Texas, even though they are starting to, which will be actually a discussion board question later on. But they do have this pay-as-you-go limitation. There's also limits on welfare spending. Texas has a certain amount of money that can spend on welfare programs, and that's it. Beyond that, there's no more welfare handed out beyond that. So that's the limits on welfare spending. They also have a limit on growth from revenue not to exceed the rate of growth of the state economy. So they cannot generate more revenue than what the state economy is generating. So the government's budget must reflect the growth of the state economy. And then there's also limit types of taxes that the states may levy. They can't add additional taxes without taking other tax types away. So that's very interesting to consider, particularly when Texas considers adding a state income tax, which they do not have right now. But if they did have to implement a state income tax, they would have to take a certain other type of tax away to balance out the system. So that's a very interesting kind of trait that is unique to Texas, that they can't add more taxes without taking other taxes away. All right. Main steps in the budget process, the major steps, budget requests by agencies. Budget requests by agencies have to be put in September of an odd year to January of an even year. The Legislative Budget Board and the Executive Budget Office reviews those requests. You have combined staff reviews during periods from January of an even year to September of an even year to consider those requests. And so they'll meet from January of an even year to September of an even year when the legislature is not in session to consider the budget for the next legislative session. So the agencies basically have to submit their budget requests a year in advance before the legislature even meets. You have preparation of the Legislative Budget Board and the Executive Budget Office. You have their recommendations. You have their independent preparation. So the Legislative Budget Board and the Executive Budget Office will kind of prep the budget for the next consideration based on the request that they receive, and that's done from September of an even year to January of an odd year. And then they have the presentation to the legislature in the January of the odd year. So even though the budget process and the budget consideration started years in advance, later on in the next year, then it'll be presented to the legislature for consideration. And so the budget in Texas is often decided 3 years in advance at a time, or even 2 years in advance at a time, whatever time frame they're looking at it. So Texas has to be very forward thinking because they have such a limited time to meet, and because they have such a limited time to consider budget considerations, they need to really be forward thinking and plan ahead and make sure that the budget is there if they need it to be. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions about that budget process, feel free to send those questions my way. That's the whole planning process. How about the authorization process? The budget is actually authorized and voted upon in the legislature. You have a number of committees involved. In the House, you have the Ways and Means Committee, Ways and Means Committees, both at the state level and the federal level, basically deal with taxation. You also have the House Appropriations Committee, which will decide on the budget and allot certain appropriations to different agencies. In the Senate, you have the Senate Finance Committee, the Senate Committee of the Whole on Finance. I'm not sure quite what the difference is, the difference between the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate Committee of the Whole on Finance. I'm not really sure. But those are the two committees that are involved in the authorization of the budget. So you have different steps during the authorization process. You have those committees involved. You first have committee hearings on budget recommendations. You have committee recommendations on appropriations. You have floor action by each chamber. So once the committee hearings are over, once the committee recommendations are over, the budget will actually be heard out in the chamber for both the House and the Senate. You have the conference committee report that will report the actual budget, and then you have the comptroller's certification. So once it's passed through, once the floor action is read, or once the floor action is done, then the Comptroller of Public Accounts, remember that's an agency of the plural executive, the Comptroller of Public Accounts will actually certify the budget. And then the governor's action, the governor will actually have to sign off on the budget, and then there's an item veto, which is possible. Say that the governor doesn't agree with a particular item in the budget, an item veto is possible. But usually the governor just goes ahead and signs off on it, and that's all part of the authorization process. So all the way from committee up to the governor signing it, that's all part of the authorization process and all part of the confirmation of the future budget. Now with the execution of the budget, you have a number of agencies involved. You have the spending agencies, the actual individual agencies that spend the budget. You have the Comptroller of Public Accounts. The Comptroller of Public Accounts can actually manage the budget a little bit more and decide whether money should be spent there or not. And then you have the Executive Budget Office and the Legislative Budget Board in the event of need to alter the existing budget. So that's kind of the oversight of the budget overall. But for the most part, the budget execution just basically is basically more or less comprised of just the agencies finally spending their budget money on what they need to spend it on. And that's all part of the budget. All right. After the budget is executed, then the looking backward, they'll audit the budget. They'll make sure that the budget was spent properly. And like I said, most of this is done by the Legislative Audit Committee and also the State Auditor's Office. But oddly enough, the State Auditor is selected by the Legislative Audit Committee. The State Audit Office is basically just supposed to be like an independent kind of second review sort of the budget. The Legislative Audit Committee will, like I said, select someone to hold the position of State Auditor, and then the State Auditor will kind of give it a second independent review. The functions of the audit are generally supposed to just make sure that everything is being complied with and that the budget is spent properly. So you have financial and compliance audits, you have economic and efficiency audits, you have effectiveness audits to make sure that the budget is spent effectively, you have state personnel classification audits to make sure that the salaries were paid properly to each government employee, and then finally the legislative committee support, meaning that if the legislative committee allowed more money to a certain program over another one, they'll go ahead and try to voice their support for why they spent the money the way they did. So that's the auditing of the budget. It's kind of just a check and a balance to make sure the budget is being spent properly. Even though not a whole lot can be done to recover the money, it's at least good to know. It's at least the thinking is that it's good to know where the money is spent and make sure that it was spent properly and keep people in check for future budgets. So that's the whole purpose of auditing the budget. All right. So we talked enough about spending and expenditures and the budget and how the government spends money and what the process of the budget confirmation is and things like that. Let's go ahead and talk about taxation, because ultimately the state raises its money through taxation. And there are three kinds of taxation, and I want you guys to at least be aware of these, and these probably will be on your test. The three kinds of taxation that are common here in the United States. There's a progressive tax, and that just means that higher income individuals pay a larger percentage of their income. The more you make, the more you pay. And most often here in the United States, we associate that with income tax. However, Texas does not have an income tax. So one of the types of progressive taxation besides income tax here in Texas specifically, one type of progressive tax would be, say, property tax. Higher income individuals usually buy higher priced houses. And the higher priced your house is, the more property tax you will pay. So that'd be an example of a progressive tax here in Texas. The more you make, the more probably better property you'll have, and therefore you'll pay higher property taxes for that higher priced house. There's also a regressive tax. Regressive tax is in contrast to a progressive tax. Regressive tax says that higher income individuals pay a lower percentage of their income. Unfortunately, I can't really think off the top of my head of a good example of a regressive tax here in Texas. Maybe you, as Texas citizens, can maybe think of one for yourself and send it my way. I'd actually really appreciate that if you did a type of regressive tax. But regressive tax is just the idea of the more you make, the less you pay, and the less you make, the more you pay. So higher income individuals pay a lower percentage of their income. And then finally, the flat tax. Everyone pays the same percentage. And the example I often give for this is the type of tax that we pay most often, and that is a sales tax. Sales tax doesn't care whether you make $2,000, $10,000, or $100,000, or even $1 million a year. Sales tax is the same flat rate for everybody, regardless of their income. I believe here in Texas it's around 9%, I believe, for sales tax. Maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong there. But a flat tax would just be that everyone pays the same percentage regardless of income, and sales tax works that way. So that'd be an example of a flat tax. So once again, if you guys think of any types of regressive taxes, I'm very sorry that I can't think of one off the top of my head, but if you do think of one, please send that my way, and I'll actually include it in my lecture next time. Regressive taxes. So progressive, regressive, and flat taxes are the three types of taxations that we most encounter here in the United States, or the three types of taxation that there are overall, I guess I should say. I just wanted to give you a quick chart real quick of the taxation types. We have the progressive tax here in the middle. It goes from low income here on the left to high income here on the right. And a progressive tax, once again, the more you make, the more you pay. So that's why this green line comes up. If you're a low income individual, say you pay 15%. If you're a high income individual, you pay 25%. Regressive tax is here in the middle. Remember, the less you make, the more you pay. The more you make, the less you pay. So low-income individuals, say, on a regressive tax would pay 30%, but a high-income individual would only pay 15%. And that's the idea of a regressive tax, this yellow line. Then a flat tax is the same for all, 25% all the way through, 25% regardless of your income. That's an idea of a flat tax. So I just wanted to give you a quick graphical representation of regressive, progressive, and flat taxes, and hopefully this makes sense for your test, as I can guarantee that there will be a question on your test about this. So, all right, well, we're going to go ahead and look at a number of charts here that deal with taxes here in Texas, and as well as spending and budgets here in Texas. We're going to look at a number of charts here. So this will be your first one, per capita tax revenue. meaning the revenue generated per person based on the state. And you can see here that Texas, because it doesn't have an income tax and it only has usually a property tax and a sales tax, maybe an inheritance tax, I'm not quite sure. Texas actually doesn't generate a whole lot of revenue. And it doesn't spend a lot of revenue either. It doesn't spend a lot either. Its revenue isn't very high and its expenditures isn't very high because Texas has a small government mindset overall. So Texas only raises, I would say, around $1,900 per person. So each person in Texas pays around $1,900. And that's on average. Some people pay less than that, some people pay way more than that, but this is the average per capita tax revenue. However, that's not that much, $1,900 on average, compared to some states such as New York. New York generates around $3,600 to $3,700 per person. So if you live in New York, you are on average paying $3,700 every year for your taxes. Massachusetts here, around $3,400 per person. So they pay a lot more. Those states, New York and Massachusetts, people in those states pay a lot more tax revenue each year. Texas has a pretty low taxes, and so Texas only pays around, like I said, $1,700 to $1,800 per person. The U.S. average over here on the far right, I'm not sure if you can see this, I apologize if my head is blocking it, but over here, on average, throughout all the states in America, the per capita tax revenue is around $2,500 or $2,600. That's on average. So Texas is actually below average on how much taxes we do pay here in Texas. On the flip side of revenue is the per capita spending. And remember, if you're not generating a lot of money through revenue, you're probably not spending a lot of money either. And that's exactly why New York and Massachusetts are on the high end here of the per capita spending. Per individual, New York and Massachusetts spends around $9,000 per person. So that's the number of amounts that they spend divided by the number of population. And that goes towards things like roads, schools, health services, and things like that. New York spends a lot. So New York and Massachusetts, they have a lot of good public sector services. They have a lot of community health services. They have nice roads. They have good education and things like that. But that's not to say that Texas doesn't spend a little bit of money per person either. However, it's a lot less than New York or Massachusetts. Texas only spends around $5,000 per person. So we spend $5,000. We spend this amount of money divided by the total population of Texas, and per person, we only get around $5,000 per person from the Texas government. And once again, that goes on to things like roads and education and health service and things like that. So that's generally why Texas ranks pretty low on on education. It ranks pretty low on quality of roads, and also the health services here in Texas aren't that great because we don't spend a lot of money per person for those things. This is where Texas ranks in total spending overall per capita spending. Overall spending per capita, well, we're actually dead last. Let me go back to that last graph here. I would like to actually have the year on that one because it says that Georgia and Florida are below us, but even then, that's not that great. We're still pretty low. So overall spending per capita, we rank 50th according to these numbers. State employee wages, state employees don't make much at all here in Texas. If you're a state employee, you're ranked 50th overall. Parks and recreation, we're 48th overall. Cash welfare, we're 48th overall, so we don't hand out a whole lot of welfare. Mental health services, we don't spend a whole lot of money on that. We're 47th overall. Public welfare / Medicaid, 46th overall. Public health, 45th. Highways, 42nd, so we don't spend a lot of money on our roads either. And then education, we're down near the bottom as well, as we only spend we're 37th in spending for education. We're 37th overall on spending money per student on education. However, Texas, welcome to Texas, where we rank really high on, is we spend a ton of money on correction facilities, prisons and jails and things like that. We spend a lot of money on correction facilities because for some reason we need to spend a lot of money per person on correction facilities and things like that. So we don't spend a lot of money. We don't raise a lot of money either because we don't like taxes here in Texas. We don't have an income tax. So therefore that's a source of revenue that we're not generating revenue from. But we aren't spending a whole lot of money either per person for these sorts of public type services. So it's a debate whether you would like nice public services to ensure the well-being of the community overall, or whether you would like kind of an individualistic attitude where keep your hands off my money, I'll deal with the poor public service sector when I can maybe turn to a private sector to subsidize those needs. So it's kind of a delicate balance, and Texas is definitely weighted on one end over the other, whichever side of the debate you may be on. So I just wanted to at least present those figures to you. Comparison, I apologize once again if this graph doesn't show up that great on your end of the video here. It doesn't show up that well on my end of the video either. But this is just a comparison of tax and non-tax sources of state revenue. Tax sources of revenue include those taxes, like I said, property tax, sales tax, and those sorts of things where state gets the money from taxes. Non-tax sources of state revenue would be things like federal grants and money from elsewhere, things like that. So you can see here that Texas takes around 50% from the latest figures. This is 2014 to 2015. Takes, I would say, actually around 45% of its tax revenue. It takes 45% of its revenue from taxes, and then it takes around 55% of its revenue from the federal government. So Texas is actually taking more money from the federal government than it is trying to get its own money from its own private citizens. That's because Texas is a pretty poor state not economically, but the government is a pretty poor state overall. So the government, in order to pay for services, needs to get money from elsewhere. And it usually gets its money from the federal government. And when it gets money from the federal government, then that's less that people have to pay in taxes, which is an advantage. But it also kind of creates this sense that Texas is on welfare from the national government. It's relying on the national government for money instead of trying to pay off its own bills. So it's very interesting, kind of interesting paradox that in Texas culture, we don't generally like welfare, or we don't like people that are on welfare, when Texas itself is actually on welfare from the national government. So there's a number of viable options that Texas could explore, and you're going to go ahead and, for one of your discussion board questions, you will explore alternative options for Texas. And one of those options would be to raise or to implement an income tax, or to raise its own taxes, or something like that. So very, very interesting kind of paradox that Texas is in, for sure. All right, so this is where Texas gets its revenue sources. Like I said, I'm not sure quite of the date on this. This does kind of contradict the previous graph, but it does take around half of its revenue does come from taxes. So it's not completely off of that last graph. It was around 45 to 50% from that last graph. And you can see here from this graph that it also does take around half, or 50% of its revenue from taxes itself. Federal funds, it takes a lot of money from the federal government. This says here 32.2%. Fines and fees, which is also a non-tax revenue source, it takes 7.8% of its revenue from fines and fees that people have to pay. Say, I'm trying to think of a few fines and fees. Say a company was found in violation of a certain statute, they might have to pay a fee for that. So that'd be a non-tax source of revenue. Interest on loans and things like that, that's also a non-tax source of income for the state. It takes about 4% of its own revenue from interest, which is not a tax source of revenue. Interest usually comes from other states. Texas can loan states to other money, loans money to other states and things like that. And then as soon as those states pay those debts back, then it accrues the revenue from those interest loans. The lottery, also a non-tax source of revenue. The lottery, anytime you go buy a lottery ticket, that usually goes directly to the state of Texas. Land income, Texas actually owns a lot of land, and when it sells off that land, it gets profit from that. And so that's also a non-tax source of revenue. And then other receipts, miscellaneous, I'm not sure what's all involved in there, but you can maybe think of a few of your own. So going back to this last graph, I guess it is on par. This is, like I said, around 50% here, 45 to 50% it looks like, of tax versus non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue being in the black, tax revenue here being in the gray. So it is pretty fairly representative on this graph as well, as all of these are non-tax sources of revenue, and then this would be your tax source of revenue. So makes sense. Percentage of taxes. Well, Texas gets its majority of taxes from the sales tax. That's why it's around 9% here in Texas. And sales tax, because so many people buy goods here in Texas, Texas does benefit from the sales tax. You have the corporate franchise tax, the motor vehicle tax, motor fuel tax, oil and gas taxes, and then the other percentage, which is probably property tax, included under that other there. So this is just kind of where does Texas gets its money from, and the clear majority of it comes from the sales tax. That's where Texas gets a lot of its money because it has a huge population, has a lot of tourists coming in and things like that. So sales tax really does benefit the state of Texas overall. Sales tax per capita, 15 most populous states. You can see here that Texas has kind of a lower sales tax than some states, but it is still pretty high. Because Texas relies so much on that sales tax, it has to have a fairly high sales tax. So this is the 15 most populous states and their sales taxes. You can see here Washington has a ridiculous sales tax. It has a really, really high sales tax. And Texas, among the 15 most populous states, ranks here at 5th. So that's very interesting. States such as Georgia and Virginia, they have a really low sales tax, but my guess is that they probably have high income taxes there, whereas Texas does not have that income tax and relies mostly on that sales tax. So I just wanted to present you the figures there. Alright, so those are the taxes. What about the budget itself? What does the budget go towards? Well, you can see here that there's a number of things that the budget goes towards. But the thing that it goes towards the most is education. 44.5% of the budget goes towards education. In second is health and human services. 31.7% of the budget goes towards that. 12.12% business and economic development. 6.2% public safety. National Reserve parks and things like that. 1.9% of the budget. Judiciary gets 0.4% of the budget. General government functions, 2.4%, legislature, 0.2%, and regulatory commissions are at 0.5%. So Texas spends most of its budget on education and health. However, keep in mind that the education and health and human services in Texas aren't as great because even though we're spending these percentages of the budget on these sorts of things, the actual amount of dollars spent on those sorts of things is relatively low compared to other states. So that's why we rank in per capita spending pretty low on education and health and human services. But for the budget itself, we spend a sizable percentage on those sorts of things. So in terms of actual dollar amounts, it's actually pretty low, but in terms of percentage of the overall budget, it's fairly high. So I just want to give you an idea of where the money of each budget is being spent. Education expenditures, let's go ahead, you take this 44.5% and you break it down just a little bit more into one little pie chart. And you can see that we spend most of our education money on public schools. So that would be like your elementary, your middle schools, and your high schools. Those are considered public schools. Two-year schools, such as vocational schools or community colleges, they get 3% of the education expenditures. College and universities, so such as Texas, North Texas, Texas A&M, trying to think of another one, Stephen F. Austin, things like that, or Texas State, sorry, those take 25% of the education budget. And then employee benefits take 7%. So teachers' health insurance, teachers' retirement plans, and things like that. That's also considered under the education budget as well. All right, allocation of federal funds. Like I said, Texas takes a fair amount of money from the federal government. It takes around 32%, I believe it said on that last slide. This is what all the federal funds are allocated towards. And most of it does go towards health and human resources, or health... health and human resources, because particularly because of the Affordable Care Act and things like that, the federal government gives certain money to make sure that medical services are up to standard. We also take federal funds and we also spend some federal funds on education. The federal government gives Texas certain monies to go ahead and spend it towards education to improve the education system here in Texas. And then business and economic development probably be third there. We like to use federal funds to encourage businesses to move into certain places. If we can build nice roads, if we can build nice infrastructure, then businesses will be encouraged to move to Texas. And that's why Texas feels like it's worthy to use those federal funds towards business and economic development. Here's the Texas paradox, though. Pros. Texas enjoys low tax rates. That's very overall statement because we don't pay income tax. We enjoy low tax rates overall, besides maybe sales tax, which is on national average, but we do enjoy those low tax rates. We have no state income tax. That's also a pro of living in a low-income state. And we can still cover a majority of its necessary expenses. However, remember, we need a balanced budget. In order to have a balanced budget and to pay for more people moving into the state and things like that, we need to raise revenue. The cons of this Texas paradox are, while we're enjoying these low tax rates, we're actually accruing debt. Texas is accruing debt, even though besides the mandate to have a balanced budget, we're accruing debt because we're having to pay for more services. But to ensure that balanced budget, we're actually cutting certain services out. But the problem is, what services do we cut? Well, we already have poor public education, as you saw. We're ranked near the bottom in spending per public education. So Texas ranks pretty low on public education. And we also have poor public services. Because we're not able to spend a lot of money on roads, parks, lands, and health services, we generally rank pretty low on those sorts of things as well. So the question becomes, how do we fix this problem? And that's something that you're going to discuss in your discussion board question. How do we compromise with the fact that we enjoy our low taxes, but we also need to provide public services such as roads, parks, lands, and health services and better education? So it's very, very interesting. And here's your overall outstanding state debt. So we have general obligation bonds outstanding by the issue agency, and this is the 2013 numbers in millions. Most of the debt actually comes from our transportation system, and that's why Texas has such poor roads. Because the transportation system, or the Department of Transportation, already has around, I'm trying to do the figures here in my head, $78 million in debt, we can't really spend more money on roads because of that requirement for the balanced budget. You can also see that there's debts within the Public Finance Authority, within the Higher Education Coordinating Board, within the General Land Office, and also within the Water Development Board. So how does Texas try to erase this debt within these certain sectors? By not raising taxes. And that's a huge question that they're going to have to face. Here you can see the state debt by general obligation bonds. I won't get into this too much, but this is kind of where the debt is coming from as well. So once again, how does Texas deal with this? Well, these are the major challenges. First off, we need additional revenues somehow. How does Texas erase its state debt, and can it do it through additional revenue sources? We also have a major challenge with education funding. Our public schools are generally underfunded here in Texas. And then also we need to ensure that we have higher education available, and we want to ensure the growth and quality of that higher education, but we don't want to spend, we don't want the state of Texas spending too much money on that, because then the accrued debt would go even higher. One obvious solution, I guess, for higher education would be to raise tuition rates, but that hurts regular students, particularly because they'll have to take out more student loans, and they may not be able to afford college overall. So that's also another major challenge with taxing and spending in the overall budget. And then another major challenge comes with health benefits. The state employees' health insurance, we need to ensure that the state employees have health insurance, but how do we do that without raising taxes? Public school teachers need health insurance, obviously, to be there in the classroom and things like that, and to ensure that they're healthy. How do we do that with low taxes, and then also health costs for the uninsured? We do have Medicaid in place, but that's often underfunded. And how do we ensure that the uninsured have health insurance, so that way the costs are not passed on to the average consumer? So these are all major challenges within the budget, and it's things that Texas is going to have to consider with part of this Texas paradox of how do we compromise our love for our kind of system of low taxes with needing to provide these public services. And these are the reasons why we're actually accruing debt. This is why the spending growth has gone up so much. First of all, is just the fact that there's more people to take care of now in Texas. We have a huge growth in population. So there's more people moving in, and we need to provide public services to ensure that our counties and our cities are able to take on this population growth. Second of all is simply just inflation. Things get more expensive over time. Inflation is just the idea that prices increase as time goes on. You can probably talk to your parents and talk to them about how much a gallon of gas was, or how much a Coke was back when they were kids compared to what it is now. And so the reason for the spending growth is also just part of inflation and the fact that things are getting more expensive. Third of all, new state services and expansion of existing services. We're having to spend more money to implement new state services that may not have been there before, and then we're also expanding existing state services as are needed. We're also having federal mandates that are put in place. The state governments are now required to spend certain amounts of money on certain programs. And so because they're required to spend a certain amount of money on certain programs, they need to readjust their budget to account for those new federal mandates. And then finally, there is generally here in Texas this unwillingness to accept federal money. You can probably think of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, however you want to say it. Texas so far has refused to accept federal money to implement the Affordable Care Act. And because they're not accepting that federal money, most of Texas's money for healthcare has to come from the state budget rather than just accept this federal money and use that towards the health and human services. So it's this kind of Texas paradox where we don't want to accept federal money because we disagree with the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, but if we did accept those federal monies, then we would be able to cover those costs. But because we're not accepting that federal money, we're having to use our own money to meet new federal mandates for the healthcare law. So it's a very interesting kind of paradox of whether Texas wants to keep its low taxes and also keep its defiance of the Affordable Care Act, versus accepting the Affordable Care Act and accepting those additional dollars and then helping out with the state debt and things like that. So it's kind of a weird, interesting paradox, and I hope you can kind of see that paradox and maybe question it just a little bit yourself. And that's where we get into our discussion board questions. First question right off the bat is actually just about what I just talked about. Number 1, what are your thoughts on Texas fiscal policy paradox? Should Texas consider raising taxes to cover its debts? Should it add a state income tax or raise any other form of tax? Or should Texas keep cutting its public services as it has done to cover this debt as a means to cover its debt? Sorry, that was kind of redundant there. But should Texas keep cutting public services as a means to cover its debt, which is what it's done so far to cut its debt overall? Second of all, I want you to address the per capita spending. What are your thoughts on the fact that Texas ranks near the bottom on almost all categories of per capita spending except corrections? I found that very interesting that Texas spends more money on corrections than most other states, but it won't spend more money on, say, roads or transportation or healthcare or even education. Why does Texas spend more on prisoners than students? I'm very interested to hear your sort of take, because I think this may have something to do with Texas culture. Or if you want to consider nationwide discussions, if you are in my federal government class, even if you're not, feel free to tackle this issue. Does this have something to do with Texas culture or a nationwide problem with mass incarceration? And because Texas has so many prisons, Texas is having to take on the problem of mass incarceration by increasing its spending on prisons. And then finally, third, is there anything you would like to see Texas spend more money on? If so, would this require a raise in taxes? Or could it be handled by some other means, such as privatization or subsidies? Points will be given for intuitive and well-argued responses. So think of something that you would like to see Texas spend more money on. But then realize that Texas has to have a balanced budget. So think of the way Texas could cover its cost. So think about whether this would require a raise in taxes, or could the private sector handle these things, or could Texas offer subsidies for these sorts of things? So think about that sort of answer. And if you come up with a great kind of intuitive plan of how Texas could cover this new money or cover this new spending, I will definitely give you some extra credit points for that for sure. So, all right, so that's the budget, that's fiscal policy, that's taxing and spending. We covered a number of topics today. So if you have any questions, send those my way. Keep in mind your essays are due May 1st, and so if you haven't started on those, be sure to start writing those and consult the writing guide as you are writing, so you can get a good idea of what I'm looking for. Other than that, next week we're going to talk about economic and social policy, which may be just a little bit different than what we covered today, and I'll leave you there, and I will see you next week.